It's kind of funny how if you do a really weird thing for a long time, you stop noticing that the thing you do is weird, right? Because everybody has weird things that they do. We are all different people, and anything will become normal to you if you do it enough, right? But then inevitably at some point, you have to explain this weird thing that you do to somebody else, and only then do you remember how weird it really is. For example, twice in the past month, I have had to talk with a colleague in UU ministry and explain to them that every October I do a sermon series called Horror Bible, in which I take the scariest and goriest Bible stories that I can find, and I preach sermons about them. I had to explain this to my friend Manish, who's the minister from Ann Arbor, Michigan, because his congregation have joined us in worship a bunch of times. They will be joining us again next week. I had to explain it to Meredith, because as the intern, the ministerial intern at Church of the River, she is going to have to preach a Horror Bible sermon later this month, which feels almost unfair, right? Like, you know, as a ministerial intern in a UU church, you're not supposed to have to do the typical things we think about with an internship, right? Like, you don't have to take coffee orders. You don't have to file any paperwork. I am asking Meredith to read 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, which seems objectively worse, but I believe that it is important. And I preach about these texts not because I want to torment you all, but because I believe that we really do need to know about these weird, scary little stories because they have important lessons to teach us. So we're going to start this year's Horror Bible series with a story from the book of Exodus that I'm guessing a lot of you will know. The story isn't short, and we're gonna walk through the whole thing, but I think we're gonna land somewhere interesting, so let's get started. So at the beginning of our story, the people of Israel have been enslaved in the land of Egypt, and Moses, the leader of the people of Israel, is trying to convince Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, to let the people of Israel leave and go be free to practice their own religion. You all know the story, I think. Normally I would say, to the congregation, shout out, fill in the blanks. Right now it's just Chris. So I'm going to say, Chris, shout out the word at the end of this sentence. Moses says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh refuses, and so Moses, with God's help, unleashes a series of plagues on the land of Egypt, each of them somehow worse than the one before it, in an effort to, turn up the heat on Pharaoh and convince him to do the right thing. And often, when we tell the story of these plagues, we just kind of list them, right? Well, plague of this, plague of this, plague of this. We don't spend any time on the individual ones. When I was thinking, okay, well, it makes sense to do a sermon about plagues, where's the passage where they list the plagues? Because I'd forgotten that they don't list them. Each plague gets its own thing. It gets its own moment when they talk about what that plague means. And I think what it says about each plague is worth examining, right? So the first time that Moses goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "I'm not going to let you go." The first plague is that the Nile River, which is an important source of water for the Egyptian people, is turned into a river of blood. And all of the fish and animals living in the Nile die, and the people of Egypt have to dig ditches alongside the Nile in order to get the fresh water that they need, but Pharaoh still won't let the people of Israel go. The second plague covers the land of Egypt in frogs. This plague is my favorite because this is a very serious story. I get that. This is a story full of famine and oppression and rivers of blood. And also, there is a moment in this story when somebody says, "You will be covered in frogs." And I think that's really funny. So, Pharaoh doesn't like being covered in frogs, and Pharaoh agrees to at least some of the Israelites' requests, and the frogs all immediately die, and everybody has to gather all the dead frogs into piles, and I am quoting directly from the text here. It says, "The land stank." And then Pharaoh, having been relieved of the frogs, decides that he isn't going to free the people after all, because now that the frogs are gone, why would he? So then we get a third plague, which sees everyone and everything covered with gnats, tiny, stinging, annoying insects. And with this third plague, we run into an important transition. This is one of the two major moments in the plague where we see something shift. Because we have these first two plagues, water turning to blood and frogs appearing out of thin air. And they're described as being things that Pharaoh's own personal magicians knew how to do. They're phenomena that, sound very dramatic and wild to us here and now, but apparently they were normal enough to Pharaoh, so he could explain them away. He could say, this is just the same kind of magic that my own magicians can do. This is not plagues from God, that's fake news. But the third plague is something unfamiliar even to Pharaoh's magicians, who somehow, I guess, have no problem turning water to blood and producing frogs out of thin air, but they cannot produce tiny insects. And so they say to Pharaoh, look, this isn't the normal magic that we can do. You should probably let these people go and do what they're asking of you. But Pharaoh ignores the advice of the experts, and he refuses to take the necessary steps to eliminate the gnats. So we go straight into the fourth plague, which is a plague of flies, which, in addition to the gnats that are presumably still there, cover everything. And the text says the land is ruined. So Pharaoh summons Moses and says, okay, I will do at least some of what you want. And Moses, who is nothing if not earnest, takes Pharaoh at his word, and the flies and the gnats go away, and Pharaoh once again changes his mind and goes back on all his promises. So then we get a fifth plague where all of the livestock owned by Egyptians die, immediately followed by a plague where everybody gets covered in boils. The part about the boils has this really interesting part where Pharaoh's magicians refuse to stand in front of Moses because they're embarrassed to be covered in boils, right? Which is interesting, right? That, we have this big public tragedy, and now that it's starting to affect people in positions of power more directly, those people start to disappear from view. Next, we have a plague of hail and fire coming from the sky, and God, through Moses, warns everybody, including Pharaoh, to take their livestock under cover. And some of Pharaoh's people take the proper precautions, but Pharaoh and a bunch of others say, no, this isn't real. They leave their livestock out in the fields, and there is a huge climate disaster of hail and fire, and the livestock all die. Now, you may be asking yourself, hang on a minute, didn't the livestock already all die 2 plagues ago? Right? There was a plague that was the livestock died. That happened. To which I will reply, yes, they did. And now they're dying again. And I guess I can just say that's not the most improbable part of this story. And also, welcome to the Old Testament. This is just how it has to work sometimes. So Pharaoh, rather upset that his livestock have now all died twice, once again tells Moses that he's going to do the right thing, and Moses once again believes him, and the hail stops, and then Pharaoh changes his mind yet again, and so Moses threatens a new plague, a plague of locusts this time. And this is important because this is where we get to this second transitional moment. Because this is the moment when Pharaoh's people start to turn on him. Right, in Exodus 10:7, Pharaoh's officials say, how long shall this fellow be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined? And so Moses and Pharaoh argue again, and Pharaoh says he can't give the Israelites all of what they want because he says, surely they're asking for these things because they have some evil purpose. He says an evil purpose that they're not telling them about, right? He says there must be some kind of conspiracy going on. And you know how it goes by now. Pharaoh eventually relents and apologizes, and Moses believes him for some reason. And then Pharaoh goes back on his promise, which leads us to the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. This is the plague where darkness covers everything in Egypt, and no one can even move because they can't see where they're going. And Pharaoh talks to Moses again and offers him a little bit more of what he's asking for. And Moses, who seems to have finally grown a spine, says basically, no, you'll either give us all of what we want or nothing. And Pharaoh kicks him out and says, if I ever see your face again, I'll have you killed. And Moses has this great kind of 80s action movie one-liner where he says, just as you say, you will never see my face again. And then we get to our final plague, which is the death of the firstborn. This is the plague where the firstborn child of every Egyptian family from all walks of life, even the firstborn animal, even the firstborn child of every animal in Egypt is killed unless they do a very specific cleansing ritual that only the Hebrew people know about. It is a truly horrific thing. It is an unspeakably terrible thing. Pharaoh wakes up in the night and he hears a cry. He hears a wail of grief and lamentation coming out of the whole of his country because so many people have died in this plague. And even the most powerful people and families must eventually be affected by the plagues that they ignore. And then finally, Pharaoh agrees to let the people go. This is not the last that we hear of Pharaoh, right? He still has a few more oppressive tricks up his sleeve, but that is a story for another day. So what do we do with all of this? Before we go any further, I just want to make it abundantly clear. I am not in any way suggesting that God created COVID-19 as a way to punish bad people. I am not that kind of preacher. But I am saying that huge earth-changing disasters have always been part of the human experience. And convincing people in positions of authority to properly respond to those disasters has always been part of how this works. Right? The plagues in this story are there because they are the kind of big tragic events that the readers of this text would have been familiar with. Right? If you were the intended audience of this story, you would understand what it would mean for the livestock to all die or for the crops to all get eaten by locusts. Those would have been real fears that you had. And that's what makes this story so effective and powerful. And so from our perspective here in the year 2020, in the middle of our own world-devouring disaster, I'd like to look at this story, and I want you to notice 3 things. We're mostly just going to let the story speak for itself because I think it mostly does speak for itself. But there's just three things in particular that I want to draw your attention to. The first thing that I want you to notice is that the plagues affect the people who Pharaoh leads way more than they ever affect Pharaoh himself, right up until the end. Right? The livestock may die, the water may become undrinkable, the crops may fail, but Pharaoh is a ruler who lives in a palace. He has supplies stored up that are going to last him a long time, right? When the Nile River turns to blood, so a lot of people have to dig ditches for water. Pharaoh is not one of those people digging ditches, right? So right up until the last plague, any motivation that he has to fix what is going on is a political motivation, not a personal motivation, right? He only even tries to fix the disasters that are hurting people in his country when his own career, as it were, starts to get threatened. And so this is similar to what we're seeing now and to what we've often seen in historic moments like this one. This is not new. I mean, look, the United States government, which has been so positively glacial in its response to COVID-19, this is the same U.S. government that let the AIDS crisis kill thousands more people than it would have if they had stepped in earlier because ignoring the crisis was politically convenient. The second thing I want you to notice is that Moses believes Pharaoh's promises for like a long time, right? Even though he has no reason to after the first couple of times that Pharaoh breaks his promises, because it has always been possible, it would seem, for a persuasive and charismatic politician to convince people that up is down and left is right, despite a stupefying amount of evidence to the contrary, especially if the people they're convincing really want to believe them. So I think it might do well for us to think about this and have a little bit of compassion for people who have been led astray in this way. It is not okay to behave in a way that can harm other people just because a politician told you that it was okay. It is not okay to support beliefs and practices and leaders who encourage people to harm other people. I'm not saying that that's okay, but I am saying that we can look at people who are doing what they are doing mostly because they have believed lies that they have been told. And maybe we can see a little bit of Moses in them. Maybe we can see a little part of them that we can at least recognize. And that will go a long way at some point towards healing the divisions that have been created. But the most important thing that I want you to notice about this text is that in the end, Moses wins. Right? Pharaoh does let the people go. He changes his mind later and tries to go get them, but by then it's too late. Pharaoh lets the people go. Pharaoh takes the steps that are necessary to end the plagues that are hurting and killing the people of Egypt. And Moses wins. Moses talks Pharaoh into doing the right thing because there is an uproar. Because the people all around, the citizens of the country that Pharaoh leads, including some of the citizens who have enough power and privilege to avoid the worst effects of some of the plagues, those people let out a cry of grief and suffering. Those people make a noise and create a call for change that Pharaoh cannot possibly ignore. There is a coming together of the people of Egypt who are grieving and heartbroken by the effects of these plagues, who say this has to stop, who say you need to take the necessary steps to make this stop. No more claiming this isn't what it clearly is. No more ignoring the people who actually know what they're talking about. No more making up wild theories. You have been told what it will take to fix this, and now you need to do it. It will not be easy, but it is what needs to be done. The story is a powerful example of how real change can happen, even to the most hard-hearted of leaders when they are confronted with the people who they claim to represent using the power that they have. It's an example of how even a small group of faithful, persistent people can work for liberation and healing in this world by approaching powerful people and pushing for meaningful change, by refusing to accept empty promises, and by writing their stories down so that someday, far in the future, people will look at the story of what they did. People will know the story of their fight for the future, and they will believe it. and they will know that they can do it too. Amen.